Hello and welcome to video 2 in session 1. So in the last video, we established that assessment is selecting the right tool to collect information and to use it correctly for the intended job. So we're going to kind of break that definition down a little bit into its own steps. So the purpose of educational assessments can be large and varied, but for our purposes, we're going to kind of focus on most of these. And some of these should be fairly familiar for you if you've been working in the educational field. But if not, let's just kind of go through them. Screening, we use screening to think of if there's any unrecognized problems that may signal later problems. Progress monitoring, we know, is used to ask, is the student making adequate progress towards an IEP goal, a standard, maybe a set benchmark? Educational assessments can also be used for instructional planning and modification. So asking the question, what can we do to help students access the curriculum and build their competencies would be a great purpose for educational assessments. Districts use educational assessments for resource allocations. Do we need more programs here? Do we need less there? Which programs should be supported? Which ones are working? In our world, in special ed and educational psychology and counseling, we know educational assessments are used heavily to diagnose disabilities and to determine if special education is necessary. And so the purpose is to really find out, does that student need a specialized education to access the curriculum? Or do they need modifications or adaptations? Do they need specialized instruction that they aren't getting through the MTSS model? Education assessment can also be used to evaluate programs. Does it work? We are going to spend hundreds of dollars on a program. We better know if it works. And then also, education assessment is used for accountability decisions. Does what we want it to do lead to a desired outcome? And to find the answer to any of these questions, or even one, we need assessments. And that's where that assessment cycle we looked at in the first video comes into play. So you really select what you want to assess, how to assess it, and then you collect the data, you analyze it, you use that data, and you share out your findings for any one of these processes. So the big key when we think about educational assessment is finding the right tool to collect the information and using it correctly for the intended job. There are thousands and thousands of assessments, and it can become tricky to decide which ones we want it to, or what we want it to do, and how do we know how to select the correct one. In fact, I'm just thinking, I teach at the high school, and we have to have an assessment for transition purposes in our IEPs, and we were using the Esther J. Our ISD is suggesting we use something called the tag. I've yet to use it. I've seen it. But we're realizing, as we just had our first day of IEPs, that data, that assessment isn't giving us data about their adult living and their community participation and their post-secondary goals. It's great assessment for other reasons, but we're finding it's not the right tool for the intended job. So let's think about then the right tools. How do we know what the right tools are? And what does a right tool mean in educational assessment? Again, the key is making sure your assessment does what you want it to do, that it collects the data so that you can analyze the correct problem, so that you can come up with a solution or a hypothesis, use it, test it, and share it out. So obviously, if we're trying to figure out why, in video one I shared this girl, she's always losing her place. I want to make sure that my next step is maybe finding an assessment that helps me decide, is this a visual tracking issue? Or is it maybe a perception issue where she needs a color overlay? So I need to find the right assessment that's going to give me the correct data. If we're screening or progress monitoring, the right tool we know would have to be brief, easy to give, has multiple iterations of it so that you can give it again and again and again. These on the screen here, if you've seen a school educational psychology report, you'll see all of these. And these are all methods that we can use as professionals too. And you will be using these to build your assessment portfolio. So you'll see a record review where they will go through past data, past grades, past testing. They'll look for any not errors, anomalies maybe in vision or in health. They will also look for any standardized assessments, formal assessments, teacher assessments that are in the record that might help us make sense so that we can select the right tools. They're also going to do formal and informal observations and write that up in their report. They'll interview the student, teacher, and the family, all as a way to get down into these tests, right? And there's basically, I should have put one more on here, 4 kind of assessments that we're probably going to look at anyways here. One is the norm reference test. When that is comparing, the results compare same age peers. Criterion reference test are ones that are looking at a specific benchmark and comparing a student to where they should be in that benchmark. Curriculum-based assessments can be paired with criterion reference tests often as a way to progress monitor. And then dynamic assessments help us probe deeper looking at it. So I think of like maybe those as kind of a dipstick and yep, there's something happening. It's kind of a picture. And then the dynamic assessment is that probe deeper into what's really happening. So I could say with my student, she's not getting through the sort very quickly, but there's something else happening. So then that dynamic assessment helps me probe deeper. And we will be talking about in session 4, the right tools have to have reliability and validity. So if you already know about that, great. If you don't worry. We will get further into that in the future. So as professionals, what are our necessary knowledge and skills? So we need to understand what types of scores and what they mean. And see if you know any of these. Stay 9 scores, raw scores, standard scores, percentiles, Z-scores, grade level equivalencies. If you knew all of those, great. If you didn't know some of them, imagine sitting across the IEP table with a parent who is just found out that their student has qualifies for special education services or has a cognitive impairment. And then we throw these numbers at them. We need to understand it, but we also need to understand it in a layman's terms too. We understand it as professionals, or we will after this course. We also need to know how to be skillful in administrating and scoring those assessments. Most of the assessments we use in especially determining students that may have a disability of some sort, even our high stakes tests, the MSTEP, the PSAT-9, NWEA, they all have some kind of standard protocol when administering the assessment. And it is super important to follow those directions for reliability and validity. And if for something happens, to note those. So for instance, we sometimes will give the gates at the high school level for comprehension, and there is a time to it, but we as resource room teachers also allow the students to continue so that we can say under a timed section, which is the standard scoring, here's what they would be. But when given that extension, which helps build our case, I think, for an extended time accommodation, here's what their score would be. But anyways, and then it's also important that we understand regulations and laws that go into the assessment process, which we will be covering in the next session. All right, look forward to video 3.